The Maserati died at the gate. Not stalled. Dead. Right there on the gravel drive off Sheridan Road. Engine ticking out its last breath like a dying animal, 12 feet from a pair of wrought iron gates that belonged to another century entirely. The horn gave one final humiliating bleat before falling silent, and the sound vanished into a wall of 200-year-old oaks that had never in their long lives heard anything so undignified. Julian Cross sat behind the wheel for exactly 4 seconds, closed his eyes, told himself this was fine. It was not fine. $63 in his checking account. An eviction notice folded into quarters in his glove compartment. A nursing license that had gotten him exactly 1 callback in 6 weeks. This one from a number with no name attached, offering triple the going rate for private care. Discretion required. He didn't yet know the man behind that number was a Mafia don who hadn't let a stranger this close to him in 8 months. An alpha who'd built an empire out of nothing but fear and good bookkeeping, then watched a car bomb take his legs and leave him a king who couldn't stand, couldn't trust, and had personally fired 11 nurses in 8 months. 0 exceptions. Then came Julian, an Omega who couldn't even keep his own car running. Loud. 22 minutes late. Broke a crystal glass in the first 90 seconds. But he was the only person in 8 months who looked at that alpha and didn't see a man in a chair. He saw a man. Period. Julian got out anyway. Scrubs stained at the collar from last night's shift at the clinic that had let him go 3 weeks ago. Denim jacket 2 sizes too big, frayed at the elbows, the sleeves pushed up to reveal wrists that were too thin but hands that were steady. Combat boots that had walked him out of 3 jobs that hadn't deserved him, and were about to walk him into one that would. 2 men in suits that cost more than his car stood at the gate. Holsters visible, watching him the way men watch something they expect to break. Both alphas, their sense sharp with suspicion and something darker, territoriality, maybe. The kind of men who measured threats in inches and ounces of glandular output. They didn't need to speak for Julian to understand exactly what they thought of him. An Omega who'd shown up late in a dying car, wearing scrubs that had seen better days, looking like he'd rolled out of bed and into whatever this was. "I'm here about the nursing position," Julian called out. Chin up, voice steadier than his stomach. "If either of you is the one I'm supposed to be examining, I'm walking back to the highway right now." Neither man smiled. But the gate opened. Julian walked the long drive alone, gravel crunching under boots that suddenly felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. The estate rose up ahead of him the way a held breath rises. Limestone and iron, Georgian in its bones, less a home than a rumor with a mailing address. The kind of place that had probably been built by someone who'd made their fortune in something unsavory and decided to hide it behind columns and symmetry. The oaks that lined the drive were ancient, their branches interlacing overhead like they were keeping secrets from the sky. Julian felt small walking beneath them, smaller than he'd felt in a long time. Inside, the air changed. Cedar. Old cigar smoke. A cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with the man who lived here. The kind of cold that radiated from a wounded alpha who'd closed himself off from the world so completely that even his scent had gone dormant, buried under layers of painkillers and grief. The foyer was vast, marble floors gleaming under a chandelier that probably cost more than Julian's entire education. Paintings hung on the walls. Old ones, the kind that belonged in museums. Julian didn't have time to study them. The housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mouth, led him through a labyrinth of hallways until they reached a door that looked like every other door in the place. "The study," she said, and left him there. Julian took a breath, stepped inside. The study was dark, all wood paneling and leather-bound books, and the kind of furniture that had been chosen by someone who valued weight and permanence. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing shadows across the room. And at the center of it all, a man sat with his back to Julian. A wheelchair beneath him instead of legs he could trust. He didn't turn around. "You're 22 minutes late," he said, voice low and rough, the kind of voice that had once commanded rooms full of men who'd kill on his word. "And you breathe too loud." Julian set his bag down hard enough that the thud filled the room. The chair turned. Lucien DeMarco looked at him the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay. Broad through the shoulders, arms roped with the kind of muscle grief builds when it's disguised as discipline. A scar through one eyebrow. A black tattoo curling from his collar toward his ear. Something old and intricate, probably inked before the bombing, back when he'd been the kind of alpha who could afford to be decorative. His jaw was sharp, his cheekbones high, his mouth a thin line that didn't look like it had smiled in a very long time. Steel gray eyes that had already decided not to be impressed. They swept over Julian like he was inventory, cataloging every flaw, every sign of weakness. Julian stood his ground, letting the assessment happen. He'd been judged before. He'd survived it. His hand shook. A small betrayal of nerves that no longer answered to him. The crystal glass of whiskey slipped and shattered on the hardwood, amber liquid spreading like a wound across the polished floor. The sound was loud in the quiet room, sharp and final. Julian didn't flinch, didn't rush to apologize on his behalf. He'd seen this before. The tremors, the loss of fine motor control, the way a body that had once been a weapon suddenly couldn't be trusted to hold a glass. He'd seen it in patients who'd been through trauma, in veterans who'd come back from war, in old men whose bodies had simply given up. It wasn't weakness. It was physics. The body did what it did, and the mind had to learn to live with it. "You'll want to fix that rug situation," Julian said, nodding at the hazard glistening near the wheelchair's wheels. "Wet floor, slick rug. Somebody's hip is going to break." Lucien's jaw tightened. Julian could smell it now. The alpha's scent, faint but unmistakable beneath the antiseptic and old sweat. Cedar and gunpowder and something else, something that might have been warm once, before everything went wrong. An alpha's scent was supposed to be potent, commanding, impossible to ignore. This one was barely a whisper, a ghost of what it must have been. The kind of scent that made other alphas dismiss you and omegas look elsewhere. And yet there was something about it that made Julian's hindbrain sit up and pay attention. Something that whispered this one matters. Julian stepped over the glass, crouched, and pulled the wool blanket off Lucien's lap. The alpha caught his wrist hard. A flash of the old reflex to control the room, to assert dominance through touch and pressure. His grip was still strong, strong enough to bruise, if Julian let it. His scent flared momentarily, anger and something else, something that might have been fear. Julian could feel the tension in his fingers, the barely leashed violence that lived just beneath the surface of every alpha he'd ever known. Julian held still, met his eyes without backing away. An omega looking at an alpha without flinching was an act of defiance, so subtle, most people wouldn't notice it. But Julian wasn't most people. He'd spent his whole life learning to stand his ground against men who thought his designation made him weak. He'd learned that submission wasn't the same as respect, and that the only way to get respect was to demand it. After a beat, Lucien's grip loosened on its own, surprised by his own force. The tension in his fingers eased, and Julian could feel the moment the alpha reasserted control over himself. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Julian had been trained to notice the small things. The way Lucien's breathing slowed, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch, the way his sense softened, just barely, from anger into something that might have been curiosity. Julian looked at what he'd been hiding. Wasted muscle. Pressure sores no one had dressed properly. The body of a man left to manage alone in a room kept cold enough to punish him. The legs that had once carried him through the world were thin, the muscle atrophied from months of disuse. There were scars too, old ones, from the bombing, from surgeries, from a life lived at the edge of violence. They traced patterns across his thighs like a map of everything he'd survived. "If I'm going to work for you," Julian said, not unkindly, "I need to see what I'm actually working with. Not what's buried under a blanket in a room that's 68 degrees. Something in Lucien's face cracked. 8 months, and no one had touched the truth of his body without flinching or performing pity. The nurses who'd come before Julian had either looked away or looked at him with such naked sympathy that it made him want to throw things. They'd treated him like a broken thing, something to be handled gently and avoided when possible. They'd seen the chair and stopped seeing the man. But Julian had looked at his legs like they were just another part of a body that needed care. No pity, no flinching, just assessment and action. The Omega's scent was clean, soap and something green, like cut grass after rain, and Lucian found himself breathing it in without permission, his body reacting to the presence of an Omega in ways he'd thought were dead. His alpha hindbrain, dormant for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed, stirred awake at the scent of this particular Omega. Clean, bright, unafraid. Lucian's grip on Julian's wrist wasn't cruelty. It was panic wearing the mask of authority. A man who'd spent his whole life equating control with survival would grab before he thinks, because the alternative is admitting he can't stop what's coming. He'd grab Julian because Julian was the first thing in 8 months that had made him feel anything other than rage or despair. What Julian offered him in that moment wasn't sympathy, which he would have rejected instantly, but something rarer. A witness who refused to look away and also refused to pity him. An Omega who looked at a broken alpha and didn't see weakness. He saw pain. He saw damage. And he saw someone who was still fighting. That combination, seen, but not diminished, was exactly what Lucian didn't know he was starving for. "You're hired," he said, voice gone strangely soft. Julian walked into the hallway afterward and let his back hit the cold wall, breathing like he'd run somewhere. The alpha's scent clung to his clothes, that faded cedar and gunpowder, and beneath it, something else. Something that made Julian's hindbrain sit up and pay attention, even as his rational mind told him to calm down. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. He'd been in dangerous situations before. He'd worked with difficult patients, with alphas who tried to intimidate him, with men who thought an Omega didn't belong in their space. But this was different. This was something he couldn't name. He had no idea that in the drawer of that desk, there was already a file on him. 2 weeks old. His name. His history. His father's death. Assembled long before he'd ever driven up that road. He thought he'd just gotten a job. He had no idea he'd walked into something that had already chosen him. The weeks that followed found a rhythm neither of them admitted to enjoying. Julian arrived at 6 every morning. His rebuilt Honda Civic, held together with duct tape and prayer, chugging up the gravel drive like a faithful but dying dog. He'd change Lucian's dressings, check his vitals, adjust his medications. He'd help him through the stretches that kept his remaining muscle from atrophy. And he'd do it without flinching at the scars that crisscrossed the alpha's thighs like a roadmap of violence. He'd also talk. God, he'd talk. Lucian had never met anyone who talked as much as Julian did. He talked while he worked, while he cooked, while he organized the medicine cabinet that had been a disaster zone before he arrived. He talked about everything and nothing, about the weather, about the news, about the jellyfish he'd read about that could live forever, about the neighbor's cat that had gotten stuck in a tree and needed the fire department to rescue it. He talked like silence was an enemy he was determined to defeat. And Lucian, who had spent 8 months in silence, found himself listening. "You're the strangest person I've ever met," Lucian said one morning, watching Julian arrange the pill bottles by color. He'd already given up trying to stop Julian from organizing things. It was easier just to let him do it. "Thank you." Julian's smile was quick and bright, the kind of smile that seemed to come out of nowhere and disappear just as fast. "I try." That wasn't a compliment. It was. "You just don't know how to give compliments." Lucian opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He couldn't actually remember the last time he'd given anyone a compliment. Probably before the bombing. Probably before everything went wrong. He'd been so focused on surviving that he'd forgotten how to do the ordinary things. "You're not the strangest person I've ever met," Julian continued, his voice casual. "That honor goes to a guy I worked with at a clinic in the South Side. He was convinced that the government was putting microchips in people's vaccines. He wore a tinfoil hat to work every day. Every single day. He wore a tinfoil hat? To a medical clinic? He said it was for protection. The patients loved him. He'd tell them all about the government's secret mind control program while he was taking their blood pressure. They'd just nod along like it was perfectly normal. Lucien shook his head, but there was something that might have been amusement in his eyes. I can't tell if you're making that up. I'm not. I swear. I have pictures. Julian pulled out his phone, scrolling through his gallery. Here. See. Tinfoil hat. Bright and shiny. Lucien looked at the phone. Sure enough, there was a man in scrubs with a tinfoil hat on his head, smiling at the camera like he'd just won the lottery. His name was Gerald, and he'd worked at the clinic for 15 years and was universally beloved despite his conspiracy theories. Okay, Lucien admitted. You're not the strangest person I've ever met. See? I told you. Julian pocketed his phone, looking pleased. You just have to give people a chance. Did you give Gerald a chance? I gave Gerald a chance. He was a good nurse. He just had some unusual beliefs. Julian shrugged. Everyone's got something. You've got trust issues. Gerald's got tinfoil hats. I've got an inability to be quiet for more than 30 seconds. That's not a something. That's a gift. Lucien laughed. It was a rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. He hadn't laughed in months, hadn't even remembered he could. But Julian had a way of pulling things out of him, things he thought were gone forever. The first time Julian caught Lucien's scent in full, he almost dropped the meds. It happened during a particularly bad spasm, one of the ones that left Lucien gritting his teeth and gripping the armrests until his knuckles went white. Julian was already there, using his weight to hold the alpha's leg still, murmuring reassurances that he wasn't sure either of them believed. And then Lucien's scent broke through. It wasn't just cedar and gunpowder anymore. It was him, the alpha beneath the wounds, beneath the grief, beneath 8 months of self-imposed isolation. It was warm and dark and intoxicating, the kind of scent that made omegas want to submit, to nest, to build a life around the man who wore it. It was the scent of a strong alpha, a dominant alpha, an alpha who had once commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure. It was everything Julian's omega hindbrain had been looking for without even realizing it. Julian's breath caught. His omega hindbrain screamed at him to press closer, to breathe deeper, to let that scent wrap around him like a promise. He wanted to crawl into Lucien's lap and never leave. He wanted to bury his face in Lucien's throat and drown in that scent. He wanted to do things that had absolutely nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with the biology that had been hardwired into him since birth. He shoved it down. Hard. Breathe, Lucien. I'm here. His voice was steady, even if his hands weren't. The spasm passed, leaving Lucien hollow, staring at the ceiling like he was searching for answers in the crown molding. His scent faded back to its usual muted state, but Julian had already gotten too much of it. He could still smell it on himself, like a memory he couldn't shake. I thought I was dead, Lucien said quietly. In the garage, 2 pounds of C4 wired under a car that wasn't even mine. I thought I was dead, and I wasn't. Now I just don't want anyone to see me weak. Julian got up for his medication, but his fingers caught on something. A thin folder wedged behind the pill bottles in a drawer whose lock had been broken for weeks. One more small thing a Mafia boss who trusted no one hadn't gotten around to fixing. He opened it before he thought better of it. Inside, a surveillance report on him. Photographs of him handing cash to his father outside a bar in Bridgeport. The same father who owed money to people who didn't forgive kindly. The photos were grainy, taken from a distance, but they were clear enough to see his face. There were more documents, too. His employment history, his address, his bank records. Everything. Everything. At the bottom, in Lucien's own hand. Loyalty despite chaos. Exactly what I need. Julian closed the folder, heart slamming against his ribs. He'd known. He'd known everything about Julian before he ever walked through that gate. Close the drawer, Julian, Lucien said from the bed. That's my business. I don't love being a file in someone's desk, Julian said flatly. But I'll let it go for now. He did close it. But something had shifted. Lucien hadn't hired him by chance. He'd chosen him deliberately before Julian had ever chosen him. It should have made Julian angry. It did make him angry, a hot flash of indignation that burned through his chest. But beneath the anger was something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. Lucien had chosen him. Not despite the chaos in his life, but because of it. Because he saw something in Julian that he wanted. And Julian wasn't sure what to do with that. The next morning, a closed-door meeting convened at a restaurant on Taylor Street in Little Italy. Vincent Crowe stood at the head of the table, heavy through the shoulders, a scar cutting one cheek, eyes doing math they shouldn't have been doing. For months, he'd been quietly working the room, one favor and one grievance at a time, waiting for the day Lucien's grip finally slipped enough for the family to look elsewhere. Vincent was an alpha, like Lucien. But where Lucien's scent had faded to a whisper, Vincent's was aggressive, overpowering, the kind of scent that demanded attention and submission. He was the kind of alpha who thought strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting doubt, never letting anyone see you sweat. He'd been watching Lucien's decline with barely concealed glee, positioning himself to take over the moment Lucien couldn't hold on anymore. A nurse who made him laugh. A nurse who made him look strong again in front of the men. That was the one thing Vincent hadn't planned for. A man who can't stand, Vincent said loud enough for the table, isn't a man who can lead. Julian had been brought in under the pretense of tending Lucien's legs. He stood instead. Are you a doctor? Julian said, pointing at Vincent. A neurologist? Because unless you are, I'd shut up about Mr. Rossi's condition. He survived 2 pounds of C4. He runs this operation from the neck up, which is more than I can say for you. The room went silent. Someone near the back choked down a laugh. Lucien set a hand on Julian's shoulder, a rare public gesture. His scent flared, just for a moment, territorial and possessive. The alpha in him had been stirring for weeks, ever since Julian had walked through that door. And now, watching this Omega stand up for him in front of his men, that alpha wanted to roar. Vincent's eyes settled on Julian with new calculation. He wasn't just a nurse anymore. He was becoming either Lucien's weakness, or the reason his grip was tightening again, right when Vincent needed it loose. An Omega who could make a disabled alpha feel strong again was a threat. A potential tool. Something to be dealt with, one way or another. Across the room, unnoticed by either of them, one of the household staff glanced down at a phone under the table and typed a short message before slipping it back into his pocket. Something was already moving that neither of them could see yet. That evening, Lucien wore a charcoal 3-piece suit, blanket over his lap, seated at RPM Steak on Kinsey Street. Security had swept the block an hour earlier. In the SUV beforehand, Julian sat across from him, adjusting his collar out of habit more than necessity. The engine idled low, heater ticking, rain starting to bead on the windshield in fat, unhurried drops. You don't have to come tonight, Lucien said, watching Julian's fingers work the fabric instead of his face. It's business. It'll bore you. You said that about the accountant meeting. I found out you're funding a scholarship for kids in Bridgeport under a shell name nobody's supposed to know about. Julian smoothed the last wrinkle out of Lucien's lapel and finally met his eyes. You're not as boring as you think you are, Mr. Rossi. Something flickered across Lucien's face. Not quite a smile. More the ghost of one, there and gone before it could be caught and used against him. He'd built Rossi Logistics out of his father's debts and his uncle's mistakes, clawed the family out of 2 decades of small-time extortion and into something that could survive an audit. Nobody outside this car knew that part of him. He wasn't sure why he'd let Julian see it. Your father called the house line again, he said instead, changing the subject the way he always did when something got too close. Marcus flagged it. He's 3 weeks behind on the VIG now. Not 2. Julian's jaw tightened. I told him not to call here. I told Marcus to send the money anyway. Julian. It's already done. Lucien's voice left no room for the argument Julian was gearing up to have. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for gratitude. Julian studied him a long moment, rain ticking harder against the glass now. Then why? Lucien didn't answer. He straightened his cuffs instead, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind that meant he knew exactly why and wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Security had swept the block an hour earlier. Julian waited outside in the SUV, medical bag on his knees, the way he always did. Someone inside Vincent's circle had leaked the reservation. Gunfire cracked through the restaurant. Not one shot, but a ragged volley. Glass detonated outward in a bright falling sheet that caught the streetlight for half a second before it hit the pavement in 1,000 pieces. Somewhere a woman was screaming and didn't stop. The smell of cordite rolled out onto the sidewalk thick enough to taste. Lucien was thrown from his chair, pinned between an overturned banquet and the sidewalk near State Street. His cheek pressed to cold concrete, one hand scrabbling uselessly for a grip his legs couldn't give him. The world had gone sideways. All noise and smoke and a sharp bite of gunfire. He could hear shouting, could hear the pop of bullets hitting walls, and somewhere beneath it all, the steady thud of his own heart. Julian's knees tore open on the concrete as he slid into the narrow gap between a planter and Lucien's overturned chair, shielding him with his body. His scent flared. Fear, yes, but also determination. The kind of fierce protectiveness that made Lucien's alpha howl. "Julian, get down!" Lucien roared. For the first time since Julian had met him, there was real fear in it. Not command, fear. Fear of losing the one person who'd made him feel like a man again. Julian didn't listen. A piece of shrapnel from the wheelchair's armrest tore into Lucien's shoulder. And still, somehow, he twisted beneath Julian, using what strength he had left in his torso to angle himself between Julian and the open street, though he could barely move below the waist. "Are you insane?" Lucien shouted, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. "Shut up and hold still," Julian shouted back. The absurdity of it, bickering like an old married couple in the middle of a firefight, was the only thing keeping either of them from falling apart. Julian's hands were on Lucien's wound, pressing down, trying to stop the bleeding. His scent was everywhere, clean and green and fierce, the scent of an Omega who had decided he wasn't going to let his alpha die. Lucien grabbed Julian's wrist with his good hand, pulling him closer. "If we get out of this, we will get out of this," Julian said, cutting him off. "And when we do, you're going to stop being an idiot and tell me what you actually want." "What I want?" Lucien's laugh was harsh, choked with pain. "You." Marcus got them out through the kitchen, past a walk-in cooler and a service door that slammed on its hinges behind them. They ended up in an old brick warehouse safe house in Bridgeport, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in a way that made everything look bruised and unreal. Adrenaline drained out of both of them in shaking waves that came in long after the danger had passed. Julian stitched Lucien's shoulder with hands that trembled but didn't stop. His breath came out in short, controlled counts, 4 in, 4 out. A trick he'd learned in an ICU years ago for exactly this, for keeping his own hands honest when his body wanted to fall apart. Lucien watched him work by the buzzing light, jaw tight against the pain, and said nothing for a long time. "You're a liability," he said quietly finally, not looking at Julian. "Your legs are dead," Julian answered, not looking up from the needle. "But you still covered me with your own body. You're still the strongest man I've ever met." Lucien's hand found Julian's on his shoulder. Not to stop him, just to feel that he was real. That they'd both made it out of that street. "My father used to say a man who needs saving isn't a man at all," Lucien said. He said it the week before rival family put 3 bullets in him outside a barbershop on Taylor Street. I was 11. I decided that night I'd rather be alone than be that kind of fool. And now I don't know what I decided anymore. He looked at Julian, something raw and unguarded moving under the exhaustion in his eyes. "Every rule I built my life on, you keep breaking." They kissed then, heavy, desperate, tasting of blood and antiseptic and the particular relief of 2 people who'd expected for 1 full minute to die. Julian's hands were in Lucien's hair, pulling him closer, and Lucien's good arm was wrapped around Julian's waist, holding him like he'd never let go. Their scents tangled together, cedar and gunpowder and green grass. And for the first time in months, Lucien felt something other than rage or despair. He felt hope. The next morning, back at Lake Forest, gray light pooled through the tall windows like it was too tired to fully commit to daytime. Lucien held out an envelope. His hand didn't shake this time. A small, deliberate steadiness he'd clearly had to work for. "Go," he said. "California. Don't come back." Julien tore the envelope open instead. Money scattered across the desk like dead leaves drifting to the floor, and neither of them moved to catch it. From inside, a small black USB drive fell out, labeled in Lucien's handwriting, "Vincent. Proof for Julien only if I'm gone." Julien picked it up. "I prepared that before you ever tore into it," Lucien said quietly. "Weeks ago, I told myself it was just good planning. A man in my position should always have contingencies." A pause, his throat working. "I don't think that's why I made it anymore." Julien gripped the drive, eyes wet. He turned it over once in his fingers like he could read the truth off the plastic casing itself. Lucien wasn't just pushing him away. He was handing him away to protect himself and the whole empire after he was gone. In the one language Lucien still fully trusted. Paperwork, evidence, a plan that didn't depend on anyone's mercy. "You keep doing this," Julien said, voice cracking. "Protecting me and shoving me out the door in the same breath. I don't know how to do one without the other," Lucien admitted. "Nobody ever taught me." Julien didn't play it. Not yet. Some truths he understood weren't meant to be opened alone. Instead, he set the drive on the desk between them deliberately, like a promise neither of them had said out loud yet. And he gathered the scattered bills off the floor without a word, not accepting them, not refusing them, just refusing to leave. Outside in the hallway, unseen by either of them, a member of the household staff paused a half-second too long outside the study door before continuing on his rounds. The same man who 2 nights later would be gone from the property before anyone thought to ask him a single question. 3 nights passed in a strange, careful quiet. Lucien's shoulder healed slower than he let on. Julien caught him twice in the hallway mirror, testing the grip strength in that arm when he thought no one was watching. Jaw set the same stubborn way it had been the first day they met. On the 3rd night, Julien found him at the window instead of asleep. The Lake Forest grounds spread out dark and silver under a thin moon. "You should be resting," Julien said. "I keep thinking about the guard rotation," Lucien said, not turning. "Marcus changed the codes twice this week. He hasn't told me why. Maybe he's just careful. Marcus is always careful. This is different." He rubbed at the scar through his eyebrow, an old habit Julien had started to recognize as worry wearing a smaller face. "Something's coming. I can feel it, the way you feel weather in a bad knee." Julien sat on the arm of his chair, close enough that his shoulder pressed against Lucien's. "Then we'll feel it together." Lucien almost smiled at that. Almost. He turned his head to look at Julien, and his sense softened, cedar and gunpowder warming into something that smelled like home. Julien's scent responded in kind. The two of them wrapped in each other without even trying. "I've been thinking," Lucien said, "about what I want. What I told you in the restaurant, before everything went to hell." Julien's heart skipped. "What about it?" "I meant it." Lucien reached up, his hand cupping Julien's jaw, thumb brushing across his cheekbone. "I want you. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if I'm even capable of being what you need. But I want to try." Julien leaned into his touch. That's all I needed to hear. At 2 in the morning, the security feed at the Lake Forest estate went dark. Lucien slept heavily, dosed on pain medication after the shooting. Julien sat in the armchair reading by a small lamp, the house around them creaking the way old houses do in the deep hours, settling into itself. The bedroom door was kicked in, a splintering crack of wood that swallowed whatever quiet had come before it. 2 men in tactical gear stormed through, suppressors fitted, the small red dots of their sights sweeping the room in jerky, mechanical arcs. Vincent Crow walked in behind them, gun in hand, smiling coldly. The same smile Julien remembered from the restaurant on Taylor Street, except now it had nowhere left to hide behind. Your chaotic little Omega is about to be a Mafia boss's final weakness, Vincent said. Lucien woke instantly, rolled off the bed, dropped to the floor, back against the bed frame. A motion so practiced it looked almost rehearsed, a survival reflex built over 8 months of nights just like this one. His scent flared, fear and rage mixing together into something potent and dangerous. Julien grabbed Lucien's silver cane off the nightstand, knuckles white around it. He was on his feet before he knew what he was doing, the cane in his hands like a weapon he'd never trained to use. One gunman lunged. Julien swung the cane into his wrist, and the weapon clattered away across the hardwood. The man laughed through gritted teeth, more surprised than hurt. Vincent said, "The debt, father-son, makes good leverage. Guess you're tougher than we figured." Julien's stomach dropped at the word father. Ice flooded through him before the anger even caught up to it. From the floor, Lucien answered, ice in his voice. Marcus moved the old man out of the city the night after the shooting on Kinsey Street. You're 2 weeks too slow. Julien's breath caught. Vincent had planned to use his father as leverage. But Lucien had protected him the moment real danger became undeniable, without ever telling Julien. Quietly. The same way he'd quietly paid off the vig on the old man's debts. The same way he did everything that actually mattered to him. Lucien fired twice from the floor, the recoil jarring up through a body that could no longer brace against it. His teeth gritted against the pain in his shoulder, the stitches Julien had placed pulling tight. One man dropped, hit in the thigh, screaming into the floorboards. The second turned toward Julien, sight settling. Lucien didn't hesitate. He fired once, precisely, and the man went down before he could pull the trigger. The suppressed shot barely louder than a cough in the ringing silence that followed. For 8 months, Lucien's greatest fear wasn't dying. It was needing someone and having them see it as proof he'd stopped being useful. But watching a gun swing toward Julien stripped that fear down to nothing in half a second, because it turned out his deepest terror was never his own weakness. It was being the reason someone he loved got hurt. That single clean shot from the floor was the first time all night he acted like a man protecting his family instead of a man protecting his pride. His scent was everywhere now, cedar and gunpowder and something primal, the scent of an alpha in full protective mode. He hit a switch on his phone. The new titanium-framed wheelchair surged forward across the room and slammed into Vincent's knee with a sound like a car door closing hard. Vincent's leg buckled and he went down screaming, the chair grinding to a stop against the floorboards, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the sudden quiet. Power was never in the legs, Vince, Lucien said, eyes cold, breathing hard from the floor where he still sat. It was always in the mind. And yours has always been weak. Marcus and the crew flooded in from the hallway, boots pounding, flashlights cutting white across the wrecked room. Vincent was dragged out, still shouting threats that got smaller and less certain with every step toward the door. How did they get past the gate? Julien asked, shaking, the cane still gripped in both hands like he hadn't quite registered the fight was over. Marcus's jaw tightened. A night shift guard. Vincent had him on payroll for weeks. He's already gone. We'll find him. Julien thought distantly of the man who'd lingered too long outside the study door 3 nights ago and felt something cold settle low in his stomach that he didn't yet have words for. When the room finally emptied, Lucien looked at Julien with an expression stripped of every layer of pride he'd worn for years. No armor left in it at all. His scent was still wild, still frayed at the edges, but beneath it was something raw and honest. I wasn't just protecting you, he said, voice hoarse. I made sure you'd never have to choose between me and your family. Julien sank down onto the floor beside him, both of them too tired and too wrung out to move to the bed. They just breathed there together in the wreckage, Julien's hand finding Lucien's in the dark. Their fingers interlaced, and Julien could feel the tremor still running through Lucien's body, the aftermath of adrenaline, of fear, of everything they'd just survived. I know what you are, Julien said quietly. An alpha. And I know what that means to you. The control, the protection, the need to provide. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Lucien's eyes closed. I don't know how to do it any other way. Then let me teach you. Gray dawn crept over Lake Forest, the kind of pale early light that makes everything look like it's still deciding whether the night is really over. The room had been cleaned, the broken door already replaced, as if the house itself were trying to forget. Lucien sat by the window in his chair, staring out at the distant gray line of Lake Michigan. Julien sat on the edge of the bed, his hands finally still, the adrenaline long since burned out and replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion neither of them mentioned. You've been quiet, Julien said. I'm always quiet the morning after, Lucien said. It's when I count what I almost lost. Julien almost asked him to list it. He didn't need to. Then Lucien's body betrayed him again. Autonomic dysreflexia, a dangerous spike in blood pressure that can hit spinal injury patients like him without warning, especially after hours of physical strain the body hadn't fully recovered from. His face flushed dark red, a headache slamming behind his eyes hard enough to make him grip the armrest. His breath came short and shallow. Something's wrong, he managed. Julien was moving before he finished the sentence, the same clean, practiced speed he'd used stitching his shoulder 2 nights before. He knew instantly what it likely was. Hours pinned on the floor during the fight, a kinked catheter line, his body screaming a warning through the only channel it had left. Lucien's scent had gone sharp and sour with distress. Don't let me die, Lucien said, gripping Julien's hand. His voice stripped down to something small Julien had never heard from him before. Not before I tell you the truth. You are not allowed to die. Julien elevated his head, checked, and cleared the line with hands that didn't shake even though his voice did. He monitored his pressure, watching him with the focus of someone who'd done this 100 times and would not lose him now. I already saved you once. I'm not doing it twice. Breathe with me. Count it out, 4 in. Lucien counted with him, ragged at first, then steadier. His eyes locked on Julien's like he was the only fixed point left in the room. His scent started to calm, the sour note fading as Julien worked. The episode passed after 15 long minutes that felt considerably longer to both of them. Lucien settled back against the chair, color returning slowly to his face. He looked at Julien like he was seeing something for the first time, not the nurse who'd walked up his driveway 6 weeks ago, but something he hadn't let himself name yet. No more hourly wage, Lucien said, voice hoarse, rough at the edges. I'm offering you the whole empire as an equal partner. Julien didn't answer right away. His hand drifted to his jacket pocket, where the USB still sat, small and heavy against his palm. Lucien had handed him proof. He'd handed him power. But the truth on that drive still hadn't been spoken aloud, and Julien realized suddenly, sitting there in the thin morning light with Lucien's pulse finally steady under his fingers, that he didn't want to hear it alone. Play it with me, Julien said. Whatever's on there. I want you next to me when I hear it. Late morning light filled the living room. Lucien and Julien sat together, the wheelchair parked beside the sofa. Julien set the small black drive on the table between them. Lucien reached over and pressed play himself. It was an old recording, he explained, pulled from a wire Marcus had planted in Vincent's car months earlier. Vincent's voice bragging to a lieutenant, unmistakable. He was the one who'd planted the bomb in the garage off South Wabash Avenue. I've suspected him for 8 months, Lucien said quietly. I've had this for 6. But suspicion isn't enough to move against a made man. Not without proof strong enough to keep the rest of the family from tearing itself apart over it. I was waiting for the day I could end this clean. I just didn't expect that day to also be the day I found you. Lucien's 6-month silence wasn't cowardice. It was the discipline of a man who understood that one wrong move could start a war with no winners. His real conflict was never whether to act, but whether he was still capable of building something worth protecting once the fighting was over. Julien didn't just give him a reason to finally move against Vincent. He gave him a future worth surviving for, which was the one thing 8 months of quiet vengeance alone had never offered him. Julien's hands shook. You needed proof. And you needed me. And you got both at the same time. Lucien drew a second envelope from beside him, the one he'd meant to give Julian from the start. Inside, a notarized contract transferring 15% ownership of a legitimate logistics company into his name. I signed this the week you stood in that restaurant and told Vincent to shut up about my legs, he said. I didn't know yet what I'd do with Vincent. I already knew what I wanted to do about you. Tears rose in Julian's eyes. You believed in me before I believed you were worth staying for. Lucien drew him gently onto his lap, his upper body still strong enough to hold him steady. Now we rule together. Not with blood. With whatever's left of us that's still worth building on. They kissed slowly in the morning light, the wheelchair standing quiet beside them. Lucien murmured against Julian's hair. I used to think losing my legs meant losing everything. Until a chaotic nurse walked in and proved that sometimes the strongest thing an alpha can do is let go of the old power to build something new with the one person who saw him when he couldn't see himself anymore. Across town, in a room no one was watching closely enough, a phone that had belonged to a bribed guard buzzed once with a message no one would read until it was too late to matter. But Lucien and Julian didn't know that yet. All they knew, standing in that quiet room, was that from this day forward, they were no longer alone. Lucien's hand found Julian's, their fingers interlacing. The alpha's scent had started to return, not fully, not yet, but something was shifting. The faintest whisper of cedar and warmth beneath the pain and exhaustion. An alpha's scent was supposed to be potent, commanding, impossible to ignore. Lucien's had been barely a whisper for months. But now, with Julian's clean, green scent tangled in it, something was waking up. Julian tilted his head, exposing the curve of his throat, an instinctive gesture of trust that made Lucien's alpha hindbrain purr with satisfaction. I can smell you, he said softly. It's getting stronger. Is that a problem? No. It's... Julian paused, searching for the word. It's nice. It's like you're coming back to life. Lucien pulled him closer, burying his face in Julian's hair, breathing him in. The Omega's scent was warm and alive, the kind of scent that made an alpha want to build a nest and never leave. I don't know what I'm doing, Lucien admitted. I've never, with an Omega. Not like this. Not where it mattered. Neither have I. Not like this. Julian's fingers traced the line of Lucien's jaw, gentle and sure. We'll figure it out together. Together, Lucien repeated, like he was testing the word on his tongue. It tasted better than he expected. They stayed there for a long time, tangled together in the quiet room while the sun rose higher and the shadows crept back from the corners. The estate settled around them, old and patient, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The months that followed found a rhythm neither of them had dared to imagine. Julian moved into the estate, not as a nurse, but as something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, because names felt too small for what they were building. He still helped with Lucien's care, because of course he did, because that was how they'd started and neither of them wanted to let go of that intimacy. But now there were other things too. Dinners eaten together in the study, conversations that stretched past midnight, mornings when Julian woke up wrapped in Lucien's arms and didn't want to move. Lucien's scent grew stronger every day, fed by proximity and trust and something deeper. Julian's too. The Omega's scent had shifted, taken on a richness it hadn't had before, something that spoke of contentment and safety and home. The household staff noticed. Marcus noticed. Eventually, everyone noticed. What are you going to do about the old man? Marcus asked one afternoon, watching Lucien and Julian through the study window. Julian was laughing at something, his head thrown back, his hand resting on Lucien's shoulder like it belonged there. Lucien's jaw tightened. He's still in Bridgeport. Still owes money. Still making Julian's life complicated. And I'm going to fix it. Lucien's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. The debts, the gambling, the whole mess. I'm going to make sure Julian never has to worry about his father again. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's generous. It's not generosity. It's... Lucien paused, searching for the word. It's what you do? For someone you love. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of approval. Good. He's good for you. Lucien didn't answer. He didn't need to. The day Julian's father came to the estate, everyone was on edge. The old man had been brought in by car, clean, sober, dressed in clothes that didn't quite fit, but were new enough to pass as respectable. Julian met him in the foyer, his expression carefully neutral. Dad, Julian. The old man's voice was rough, worn down by years of bad decisions and worse luck. Your alpha, he said. He's not just my alpha. Julian's voice was flat. He's more than that. Is he? Because from where I'm standing, he's a man who can't even stand up on his own. What kind of alpha is that? Julian's scent flared, anger, sharp and sudden. He's more of an alpha than you'll ever be. And he's done more for me than you ever have. The old man flinched, but before he could respond, Lucien wheeled into the room. His presence filled the space like it always did, commanding attention without demanding it. His scent was fully back now, cedar and gunpowder, and something warm and rich underneath, an alpha's scent in full glory, the kind of scent that made people sit up and pay attention. He wasn't the broken man who'd sat in that study 8 months ago. He was someone new, someone who had found a reason to keep fighting. Mr. Cross, Lucien said, his voice polite but cold. I've asked you here to settle an arrangement. An arrangement? The old man's eyes narrowed. What kind of arrangement? Lucien gestured to Marcus, who stepped forward with a folder. Your debts have been paid in full. All of them. To everyone you owe, including the people who would have killed you by now if I hadn't intervened. You're free and clear. The old man stared at the folder like it might bite him. Why? What do you get out of it? I get Julian's peace of mind. He's been carrying you his whole life, and it's time he stopped. Lucien's voice softened almost imperceptibly. I don't need anything from you except your absence. Stay out of Julian's life. Stay out of trouble. And if you ever come near him again asking for money, I'll know about it before you get within 100 miles of him. The old man's face went pale. You're threatening me? I'm offering you a choice. A clean slate, or a messy end. Your pick. After the old man left, confused, shaken, but ultimately grateful for his freedom, Julian found Lucien in the study. You didn't have to do that, Julian said quietly. I know. You paid off all his debts. You made sure he was safe. Julian's voice broke. You did all of that for me. I would have done more. Lucien reached out, his hand finding Julian's. I would have done anything. Julian sank onto his lap, the same way he'd done that night in the storm, the same way he'd done 100 times since. His scent was warm and open, the scent of an Omega who had found his place in the world. I love you, Julian said. I don't know if I've said that out loud yet, but I do. I love you, and I'm not going anywhere. Lucien pulled him close, burying his face in Julian's hair. I love you too, he said. I didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone. I didn't think I'd ever have a reason. But you. He pulled back, meeting Julian's eyes. You gave me a reason. They kissed slowly, deeply, the kind of kiss that said everything words couldn't. The study was quiet around them, the estate settling into the evening like it had finally found its balance. The next morning, Julian woke in Lucien's bed, tangled in sheets that smelled like both of them. The sun was just rising, casting pale gold light across the room. Lucien was awake too, watching him with an expression that made Julian's heart ache. You're staring, Julian murmured. You're beautiful. Julian's cheeks flushed, a reaction he couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried. You're biased. I'm accurate. Lucien's hand found his, their fingers interlacing. I've been thinking about something. What? The future. Lucien's voice was careful, like he was testing each word before he let it out. I want you to be my mate. Officially. With everything that means, the claiming bite, the scent bond, the whole thing. I know it's fast. I know we haven't known each other that long. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he smiled. That quick, bright smile that Lucien had fallen in love with. Yes, Julian said. Yes, of course yes. The claiming ceremony was small and private, just the two of them and a few trusted members of the household. Lucien didn't want a spectacle, didn't want to announce it to the world until he was sure it was secure. But when he sank his teeth into the curve of Julian's throat, when the bond snapped into place with a force that made them both gasp, he knew he'd made the right choice. The claiming bite was a sacred thing in their world, a mark of ownership and love, a promise that went deeper than words. Julian's scent shifted, deepening, rich with contentment and love. Lucien's did the same, the cedar and gunpowder warming, softening, becoming something new, something that belonged to both of them. Mate. Lucien murmured against Julian's skin. Mate, Julian echoed, his voice trembling. Winter turned to spring. The estate bloomed with new life, the oaks putting out fresh leaves, and the gardens coming back to life. Lucien's health stabilized, his body finally responding to the care Julian had been giving him all along. He still couldn't walk, still needed the wheelchair, but the pressure sores had healed, the muscle had started to rebuild, and the tremors in his hands had faded to almost nothing. "I'm not ever going to be what I was," Lucien said one afternoon, watching Julian tend to the garden outside his study window. "I know." Julian came to stand beside him, his hand resting on Lucien's shoulder. "And I don't care. You should. I used to be. You used to be a lot of things." Julian's voice was gentle. "You were a killer and a king and a man who built an empire out of nothing. And now you're a man who loves someone. That's not a downgrade. That's a promotion." Lucien turned, catching Julian's hand and pulling him closer. "You always know what to say. I'm very smart. Arrogant, too. That's part of my charm." Julian leaned down, pressing a kiss to Lucien's forehead. "I love you. The whole package. The chair, the scars, the control issues, all of it." Lucien laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep. "You have control issues too, you know. You just hide them better." "I hide nothing," Julian said, grinning. "I am an open book. You're a mystery wrapped in denim and combat boots. See? You're getting better at this." Summer came, hot and bright, and with it, a new threat. Vincent had been behind bars for months, awaiting trial on charges that would put him away for decades. But the family was fracturing, old loyalties pulling in different directions, and there were whispers that someone else was making a play for power. Lucien and Julian sat in the study, the USB drive between them, the one that had started it all. "I should have destroyed this," Lucien said. "After Vincent was arrested. I should have burned it and moved on. But you didn't." "No." Lucien's jaw tightened. "Because there's always another Vincent. There's always someone who wants what I have. And I need to be ready." Julian nodded slowly. "Then what do? We prepare. We strengthen our position. We make sure no one can touch us." Lucien reached for Julian's hand. "Together. Together," Julian repeated. The first challenge came 2 weeks later, in the form of a rival family making overtures toward Lucien's territory. Marcus brought the news, his expression grim. "They're testing us," Marcus said, "seeing if the old man is still in charge. Then we show them he is." Lucien's voice was cold, commanding. "I want a meeting. Tomorrow night. At the warehouse." Julian stayed quiet through the planning, watching Lucien's authority fill the room. He could still smell the alpha's scent, warm and strong, the scent of a man who had found his purpose again. It was beautiful to watch. The meeting at the warehouse didn't go as planned. There was blood and violence, and a moment when Julian thought he might lose Lucien forever. But in the end, the rival family retreated, and Lucien was still standing, or rather, still sitting, still commanding, still the undisputed ruler of his empire. Julian found him afterward, alone in the empty warehouse, his wheelchair parked in the middle of the concrete floor. The alpha's scent was dark, anger and adrenaline fading into something else. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, crossing to him. "I am now." Lucien reached up, pulling Julian down into a kiss. "You're my anchor, you know that? You're the only thing that keeps me centered." Julian smiled against his lips. "That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of privilege." The months that followed were quieter. Not easy. Nothing in Lucien's world was ever easy, but quieter. Julian settled into his new life, into the role of being Lucien's mate and partner, into the rhythm of a world that had once terrified him. He still remembered the first day he'd driven up this gravel drive, his car dead at the gate, his life in shambles. He remembered walking into that study and seeing a broken alpha who didn't want to be saved. And now here they were, a Mafia Don and his Omega, building something new out of the ashes of both their pasts. You know, Julian said one evening, curled up in Lucien's lap while the alpha worked on paperwork. When I took this job, I didn't expect to end up as the Don's mate. Lucien snorted. When I hired you, I didn't expect to end up in love with a man who wears combat boots to work. You love my boots. I tolerate your boots. Liar. Julian kissed the corner of his mouth. You love everything about me. Lucien set down his pen, pulling Julian closer. I do, he said softly. I really do. The story reminds us that strength was never about standing without help. It was about letting someone see you sitting down and choosing to stay anyway. Lucien didn't heal by standing again. He healed by finally letting one honest person see him when he couldn't stand at all. He healed by learning to trust, to share power, to open his heart to an Omega who refused to see him as weak. And Julian didn't just find a job. He found a partner, a purpose, a place to belong. He found an alpha who saw him as an equal, who valued him for who he was, not what he could provide. They built something together, something that didn't fit into neat categories, something that defied expectations and rewrote rules. A love that had started in the most unlikely of circumstances and grown into something unshakable. The estate settled around them, old and patient, a witness to all that had passed. The Oaks had seen centuries of change, and now they watched over two men who had found each other against all odds. Julian pressed his nose to Lucien's throat, breathing him in, letting the alpha's scent wrap around him like a promise. Lucien's arms tightened around him, holding him close, never wanting to let go. Forever, Julian murmured. Forever, Lucien agreed. And somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight, marking the passage of time. But for Lucien and Julian, time had stopped. They had found their forever, and nothing would ever break that.